Oh.
Hello, everyone. My name is Henry Trix. I am the Schumpeter columnist at The Economist, and welcome to you all to today's discussion, which is called The Future of Europe and the Bossy State. Is there a right approach to regulate global digital platforms? And is there a role of the state to unleash creative destruction? The event today is hosted by Vision think tank in Rome and is part of the Next Generation series. We have an amazing panel with us today from government, academia, and business. And we have one or two economist journalists as well. Now, you'll have noticed that the phrase Bossy State is in the title. And you may wonder what it means. Well, it comes from a cover story by my colleague, Jan Piotrowski, who is going to be talking today. And he wrote this story in January. Note, he doesn't talk about the big state nor the regulatory state. He talks about the bossy state. And what that means in Jan's words is the state acting as a backseat driver, telling companies how they should run their business. So today, we're going to look at the state's role as a backseat driver in the European Union and the strengths and weaknesses of its attempt to regulate digital platforms. Is it driving us in the right direction, or is it driving us right off the road? Francesco will start us off on that topic in a second, but just before he does, a couple of housekeeping points. Towards the end of the session, we will have 15 minutes allotted for Q&A, and people can write their questions in the Zoom chat or on our Facebook page, and a few of you will be invited to speak directly. In the meantime, we have a lot to get through, and we have a lot of speakers, so I will encourage you to be as precise in terms of your timings as possible. And let's start with Francesco Grillo of the Vision think tank, who has 4 minutes. Thanks, Francesco.
Thank you very much, Harry. It's always an honor to be with you. The Economist to me is a sort of the Bible, as jokingly we said many times with Jan Piotrowski. Harry, more specifically, is the Schumpeter columnist, editor of the columnist of the Economist. Schumpeter is the meat for us, for whoever is really keen about innovation. So, but without further ado, let me go to 3 slides that can probably help to frame the discussion. Can you see them?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So, having said that, the question of what Europe should do with digital and with global digital platform is part of a much wider question that Jan tried to address with the Bossy State. Here is the problem. This is one of the possible numerical representation of the question that the EU is trying to address. Here we are talking about market value. As many of you know, market value is the discounted sum of the net cash flow of a company. So it is the value that the financial markets give to a certain company. And if we talk about market value, the European Union is literally trashed. No, so probably it's too much of a word. The reality is that there is no EU company among the top 20 most valued companies of the world. I think Louis Vuitton is number 25. And in fact, if we consider the total market capitalization of the Deutsche Börse, the German market share, the Frankfurt market share, which is by far the biggest, it is enough to consider just one of the big internet giants, that can be Microsoft or Apple, to have a bigger value. However, if we see this representation, it is the numerical representation, it is the market value at the beginning of May, okay? As a matter of fact, right, the so-called gatekeepers, or at least this is the name that the European Union gives to MAMA, actually MAMA with one M, with two A, so Meta, Amazon, Alphabet, Microsoft, and Apple. They are 4 out of the 5 largest companies. However, the universe of the big companies, big corporations of the world, as far as market value, is very differentiated. We have companies which are trying to become platform, like Visa, but even like Johnson & Johnson and United Health or Walmart. We have companies who are more like enablers of the technologies, like the big chip makers. And we also have Tesla, which is a company in its own category. We just have 2 companies that I'm here defining as boomers company. I don't know if whether Warren Buffett would be happy to be called a boomer, but you know, this is a little bit. And the thing is that even if we consider Microsoft, Apple, Alphabet, Amazon, and Meta, they are very, 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 and Tencent, by the way, WeChat, they are very, very different among them.
Francesco, can I just interrupt you for a second? Yeah, because you told me to be disciplinarian on time. Okay. And you're running out of time.
Okay. I basically finished. This is what I already shared with you. No? So this is an attempt that we are doing to count the legislative acts that the European Union is producing. And this is just an evidence. We are talking about 6 regulation or directives or proposal for regulation in the last 6 years. And they sum to more than 700 pages and 450 articles. So this is an evidence that I will leave to your comments. I have another slide, but we may go back to that. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much. Right, well, to move on, Jan Petrovsky, who is my business editor at The Economist, and so I answer to Jan. But now, Jan, I'm giving you, I think it is 4 minutes to, well, yes, okay, right, somewhere between 4 and 6. Go ahead.
4 and 6, that's fine. And also today I answer to you, so do please interrupt me whenever you feel that is warranted. Thank you so much, Francesco, for organizing this event. As you can imagine, the subject is very dear to my heart. Now, I wanted to place it because we're going to be talking with the other panelists, sort of more specifically about tech. What I wanted to do maybe is place that phenomenon, the phenomenon of tech regulation, within the broader context of what I called the Bossy State. And that appears to be a sort of coincident, if not exactly coordinated, effort by governments just about everywhere, or at least in the world's biggest markets. So America, Europe, and China, to become much more interventionist, to sort of rediscover the interventionist zeal that dominated the relations between the state and business back in the 1970s. And there are several reasons for that broad move, of which greater emphasis on regulating tech platforms is one part. One reason is that the world has got much more complicated and tensions between countries are rising. And as a result, national governments are more worried about being unduly influenced either by their over-reliance on certain suppliers in countries which are not exactly friendly, or simply by not providing the sort of rise in living standards that that citizens have come to expect. And as a result, they're seeing sort of, this is the perception of many governments and of many citizens, is that the capitalism as the sort of freewheeling capitalism of the 1990s and 2000s has not really worked out for everyone. And in fact, for masses of people, it has not worked out at all. That is the sense. And so governments are responding to this sort of geopolitical imperative on the one hand, with geopolitical rifts deepening between especially between China and the West, which have become incredibly integrated in global commerce over the past 20 years. And on the other hand, this internal push towards greater, sort of more invasive approach to business by the state to make sure that the spoils of economic growth are shared more equitably in society and not just skimmed by the shareholders of these large companies that Francesco was highlighting. And the result of that is governments everywhere again, and it's interestingly enough, very similar factors feature in the calculations of both the West and China. I mean, China is obviously an authoritarian state, but it still sort of answers a little bit. It has to keep its prerogative. It's sort of its imperative is to maintain social stability, and in order to maintain social stability, you need. I mean, you can do it by putting people into a gulag, but China has long decided that actually making life better for Chinese people is a much easier way of maintaining stability and therefore control. And obviously it has the similar geopolitical imperatives, mutatis mutandis, as the West does with respect to China. So it just because it's an authoritarian country does not mean that it does not, respond to certain forces that are buffeting other more democratic places. Now the result is that there is an expectation, both by citizens and in various countries and by governments, that governments need to be more involved in business. And that, as I highlighted in the special report, takes several forms. One is industrial policy, which sort of plays into the tech sphere a little bit, certainly on the sort of hard tech side of chip making, which is obviously, which undergirds everything else that really happens in the digital realm. Antitrust policy, which has become much more ambitious in the past couple of years, pursuing not just sort of a narrow understanding of consumer welfare in terms of higher prices, but also a much broader understanding of trying to avert consumer harm that is variously defined, but often quite nebulous. There is just general regulation, again, of the sort that Francesco mentioned. Now, the total of 700 pages may seem a lot, but if you compare it to some of the blockbuster bills that America's Congress passed recently, like the infrastructure bill, those are typically counted in thousands of pages. And the problem with that is, a little bit, is that historically, the sort of the overall stockpile of regulatory edicts rises inexorably. It basically doesn't come down. So whenever you pass a bill, that bill is there almost forever. And then you pass the next one, which adds to the regulatory burden. And when you look at the number of statutes being passed in various big markets, they're basically it's a linear, more or less linear line going up and to the right. So that's regulation. The other way that states are intervening is a sort of the rethinking the way that corporations, multinational corporations especially, should be taxed. So the regulatory part, or especially specifically the tech control part, is mostly antitrust policy and regulations, which we will discuss further later today, with a smattering of trying to be a little bit more punitive on taxes, which obviously many governments feel tech firms are not paying enough of, and taking with one hand, but also giving away to some people, to some companies with the other hand in the form of subsidies to try and bolster national champions, including in the digital realm. So I will stop there because I just wanted to sort of sketch out the broad framing, maybe within which today's discussion can continue. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, Jan. Thanks very much indeed. So to speak to us next is Sabrina Pignedoli. Sabrina is a member of the European Parliament Artificial Intelligence in Digital Age Committee. Sabrina, over to you. Thanks.
Thank you. First, thank you for organizing this event. I think it's very important to discuss a topic such as digitalization. As you know, the Digital Service Act and the Digital Markets Act aim to establish the rules governing the digital service in the EU. The initial Commission proposal published on December 2020 did pretty much incorporate what was initially proposed by the Parliament and split in the reform into legislative packages. Concerning the ongoing process, just this morning, the Parliament Initial Market Committee voted and approved the provisional agreement reached at the interinstitutional level on the Digital Service Act. We will vote for the first reading during the plenary in July. Regarding to the topic of digital technology, we know that our future depends a lot of the role Europe is playing on this issue. Personally, I do not think it is possible to compete with the US and China in terms of technological quantity. The path that Europe must follow is that of the quality in the use of digital systems and artificial intelligence, because the user of these systems and services demand secure and reliability technologies. In fact, Europe is proposing a harmonic regulation that will to put the defense of citizens' rights in front of everything. I think it is the right path that follow, although we need to avoid the risk of over-regulation. As a member of AIDA Special Committee on Artificial Intelligence, I realized that it's not wise to push a legislation on artificial intelligence without taking into account its special characteristics. A technology evolves faster than legislative processes. The risk is that we come up with a legislation which is already old. This is why it is absurd to try to regulate every aspect of new technologies and artificial intelligence. Instead, it is important to have a general regulatory framework which can be adapted to the development in the technology, new discoveries, and to the business initiative. Of course, these are not easy topics to deal with. In the AIDA committee, there were some issues that polarized the debate. For example, on the one hand, privacy, and on the other, the need for artificial intelligence systems that have a lot of data in order to be able to learn and function better. An issue that became all the more important when it came to medical data. Also, the issue of facial recognition, which has created a great debate. Artificial intelligence could become a surveillance system on citizens, but at the same time, it can support the security. How can we balance these aspects? I close my speech with an anecdote which shows the difficulties of the topic. The conclusion of AIDA committee, a study was presented about the various European regulations concerning the digital world, showing that there are overlaps, gaps, but above all, the same thing is often regulated differently. This is why I want to underline that it's good to focus on quality of rules, but we need to keep in mind that characteristic of the object we are going to standardize, a fluid technology which changes quickly and which will be of strategic importance for the future of Europe, its citizens and its companies. Thank you very much, and I'm sorry for my English. And I sorry because I have a delegation meeting and I can stay with you only a few minutes. I'm sorry. Thank you.
Okay, Sabrina, thank you so much. That was incredibly succinct and very, very clear. I will try and emulate your ability to stick with the clock. As Francisco said, Schumpeter is the father of innovation, constantly hammering home the importance of creative destruction. And sure enough, in The Economist, we love those kind of small, scrappy, innovative firms. Yet there's another side to Schumpeter's thinking that's also worth considering, and that's called creative accumulation. And the idea is that during economic upswings, innovation is just as likely to come from the R&D department of big firms as they are from small upstarts. And the big creative accumulators of the past decade have been the cash-rich tech giants. Now, I make this point as part of a discussion looking at the way that antitrust and tech regulation in general has become far more expansive and politicized across the rich world. I'm going to talk just very briefly about America here rather than Europe, because all the European experts are on this panel. And the main point is that many governments seem to be obsessed with this problem, what the neo-Brandesians call the curse of business. Sorry, the curse of bigness. And yet bigness should not in itself be a problem if it spurs innovation and creates the kind of products that consumers love. So in America, bigness is really in the spotlight this summer. There are two big antitrust bills going through the Senate, both aimed at big tech. And one of them, the American Innovation and Choice Online Act, targets self-preferencing by companies. So that means, for example, does Amazon favor its own batteries over the batteries of a third-party seller? Now, there's obviously good reason to be concerned about self-preferencing, and there are plenty of small, innovative, brilliant companies that have alleged that Amazon has ripped them off and put their products online, and it is something that should be looked at. But the problem is that when you look at the regulation, you realize that actually there is also just a problem with bigness. The Act takes aim at just a few companies, at the big tech companies. It sets out certain parameters, such as the number of users, the market cap, etc. But if you talk to the tech companies, they say the trouble is that this bill attacks us, but it doesn't attack TikTok, for example. You know, pretty soon TikTok is also going to be big tech. So bigness itself is something that you have to be very careful with. Now, let me just sum up by pointing to a few things that The Economist has said with relation to this. What should we do? There is this consumer welfare standard that Jan pointed to, but the sort of elements of market power that regulators can look at can go beyond price. For example, abusive, dominant, big firms typically exhibit persistently high returns on capital, or they have high market share, or they face a lack of credible new entrants. And in tech, that doesn't mean the tech giants themselves as a whole are a problem. There are particular parts of their business, such as search or app stores or whatever, that may be the focus of attention, not the entire industry. So I would just say, let the economic cycle work for the regulators. Creative accumulation occurs in good times. Creative destruction is most apparent when things turn nasty, and perhaps the collapse in big tech share prices this year amid the specter of inflation and higher rates and everything else is a sign that they too may be threatened by creative destruction, and all that regulation may be a bit too late. Thanks, that's it from me. Now let's go now to our discussants. And firstly, we have here Eleonora Faina, who is the General Director of Anitec Asinform, the Italian Association for ICT. Thank you, Eleonora.
Hi guys, and thank you, Vision, for the invitation. Very quickly, I'm sorry because I have to leave you in a few minutes because I have another call coming up. Just some comments, because there are some colleagues that are much more experts on regulation than I am. And so we have also some companies. So maybe the discussion will be fully enriched with our comments on the point of how to set the correct standards on regulating digital platform or digital economy in a certain sense, broader sense. Some comments and some reaction on Jan said before. Mainly want to say that historically Europe has a huge experience in intervention of the states in economy, even in the countries that are less more competitive, like UK before UK exited the European Union, but actually France, Italy, and all the other countries experienced a very long history intervention of state in economy and in companies especially. France is one of the maybe the big champion of how to introduce public money to make companies profitable and competitive. And this comes, we should react and reflect how it impacts innovation of Europe, how the intervention of the state has impacted in the last 50 years, the competition, and how it's impacted innovation in our continent. Mainly my opinion is that there are some lights and some shadows, mainly more shadows than lights, if we compare the digital economy. When you come to regulation, it's part of industrial policy. It's not something different. So when we talk about regulation and in fiscal support, all these instruments are part of how you build an efficient and proactive industrial policy. What we experienced in the last years in Europe is that constant tension to introduce more regulation than doing support innovation. And 27 member states has different innovative policy if we consider a Horizon 2020 as the main one Europe has in the last decades. But the result is that we don't have the ability to have a European champion in any of the sector we have, if we just avoid to consider Airbus like a big result. But I mean, out of Airbus, all the 27 member states are experiencing an inter-competition one to the other. And the antitrust policy just follow the money in a certain sense, because maybe Antonio will be more precise on that. But what we did in the last year is to avoid that between member states or among member states when applying rules on competition, we avoid to have the companies in one member state or in two member states or more than member states to try to overcome one to the other, a concentration or have a cartel and so far. So the point is that our continent was likely close if we consider the possibility to develop an innovative market for a digital economy that needs to have a much more broader market, a much broader approach. And when we talk about consumer, our policy was always tend to satisfy consumer needs, reduce prices. Sometimes maybe we didn't balance enough the needs to have much more quality and more to access to quality that probably innovation should provide better than we have done right now, right in this moment. When it comes to, and on the result of the approach that we experience in different sectors that before today was regulated, like energy or transport, TLC, and when it comes to other sectors, the postal market, for example, one of these, there was a different history. And we cannot forget that the history is totally different when it comes to Facebook or when it comes to Amazon, and then when you go to this old sector. So the point is that if we have, is the time to use another framework to set rules to promote innovation and competition, or if we have or is the momentum just to understand that but maybe the idea we have of regulated markets is totally different when it comes to digital sector. We cannot apply the same framework to this area. At the very end, the point is that we are not champions in any of this sector. but we are champions in regulating this sector. So why the United States has no sensitiveness on this point, I don't feel that the point is that do not support competition. I don't feel they have the history, because FTC is leading the leading authorities when it comes to competition. Maybe the balance of interest they're supporting is a little bit different. And at the very, very, very end, and I'm going to my conclusion, when you go to financing and funding of innovation in Europe, the money support and the strategic support, the intervention of regulatory boards, intervention of bureaucracy is something that's limiting all the capacity of our countries to develop a common approach and to common funding. The Next Generation EU is one of the first experience we are supporting. We are using common bonds just to support innovation and to support the recovery after the pandemic, but still we don't have a common fiscal policy. We don't have a common framework to support in a shared approach innovation. So I don't feel that the European Union is on the right path, introducing more than 70, 43 or whatever articles to regulate companies. Maybe the result will impact more the SMEs. They're still the backbones of our economy. So the balance could be not so satisfiable at the very end. And the point is what we are looking for. So which is our priority? Which are the things we want to promote? We want to promote to fight or to find a way to rebalance the power of the US versus China, or we want to have a common space for Europe to have innovation, or do we want just to give some results and some answers to the needs of citizens to feel like much more protected by something they do not understand? And so compare which are the needs, and so compare which are the intent you can pursue, maybe the answer could be different. And so the instruments could not satisfy all your needs. At the moment, I feel that we are just supporting the needs to have something, just to say something. Setting some standards, maybe in GDPR, but still, not that privacy is not still a problem right now. Maybe just young guys are still taking their photos and put it on the social network. So something's lagging behind, I feel.
Great, Eleanor. Thank you very much indeed. Well, to give us the view from the tech land itself, I turn to Diego Ciulli, who is the head of government affairs and public policies at Google, Italy. Hi, Diego.
Hi, and thank you for having me and for this interesting conversation. Well, let me start by stating that I think we should analyze each piece of proposed European legislation and regulation from a different perspective. I'm not 100% convinced that everything could fall into the framework of the Bossy States, and there is something that is actually good regulation, and there are other pieces of regulation that are not bossy, are just simply regulation designed to protect pieces of the European industry from innovation. That's even worse because they even hinder innovation of the European industry. So with this framework in mind, I'll go very quickly. And of course, the DMA is the first piece of legislation that comes into everybody's mind when talking about the Bossy State. Well, in that case, I think that we totally agree with the principles and the ideas behind DMA. We support stronger interoperability, we support consumer choice, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. DMA is an example indeed of Bossy State, because that piece of regulation is super detailed. Sometimes it even overlaps other pieces of European regulation. I'm thinking about GDPR, for example, when it comes to using users' data to improve services. And most importantly, but it's been already raised by Henry before, it's extremely narrowly targeted to 6 to 8 American companies. So it creates the suspicion that it's not designed just to protect users, but as a tool to protect potential incumbent or even to create European champions. I don't think this is the right path to accelerate the creation of European champions indeed. But this part of the has been already covered by much of the speeches before. I'm most interested in the other parts because from Google perspective, I think this is the most interesting part. Some pieces of legislation and regulation are actually good and very well needed even from the companies to better operate in Europe and globally. The first example that comes to my mind indeed is DSA. We have for years made the point that the digital platform had too much responsibilities. We were aimed at guaranteeing free speech, and that was the reason why we were created originally and why we succeeded. And then it was asked to us to police bad content, hate speech, disinformation, etc., etc., etc. And in too many cases, we had on our responsibility both of hosting and being neutral about hosting the content, and then taking very complex decisions on the balance between freedom of speech and other rights. So the mechanism designed by the DSA can be discussed, of course, and we have raised some criticism, but the idea that in the end is some kind of public authority that has to decide what could stay or not stay online and balance two rights, I think is something that is good, and it's good to advance. Similarly, and I won't spend too much minutes on that, is the GDPR, but really from a data-intensive business perspective, we do know that our users pretend more respect for their privacy and their data. We are super committed in offering services that are respectful of user data protection. And we also know that users often feel protected if the law protects them. So GDPR largely has been inspired by practices that companies like Google has implemented in their services for years, in particular user control and data portability, and have made compulsory for the whole market. So that's an example of a fairly good legislation of regulation. The third framework that I would like to share with you is the legislation that is not Bossy State, but is actually driven by other pieces of the industry. And the usual suspect here is the European Copyright Directive. So in that case, there were three rights at stake: the users' rights, the citizens' rights, the rights of the digital platforms, and the rights of the publishers. And it's crystal clear that in that balance, the rights of the publisher have been overestimated compared to the rights of the users to have access to information and of the role of the platform to spread that information. It's a piece of legislation that actually is being extremely challenging to implement, and it's taking quite a lot of time to European member states to implement that. What is interesting, and I want to raise this to your attention, it was not in the scheme that was shown by Francesco at the beginning. It's even if a European Copyright Directive has not yet been implemented, I think in 10 European member states, there are already open conversation about a new directive called the Media Freedom Act to give more rights to the news publishers, even before it's assessed if the European Copyright Directive worked. I wouldn't frame it as a bossy, indeed. This is more an example of capture state, or of a policy making designed to defend some peculiar interests within the market. And to conclude on this part, think about the conversation about telco taxes or network fees taxes. So now it's taking momentum, the idea that given that all of us here are talking for free on Zoom and enjoying paying Zoom only by paying our internet connections, Zoom should pay telco companies for their ability to help us having this conversation tonight. This is what's happening today in Europe, and this also was not in Francesco's scheme. And it's another example of legislation pushed not by the general interest, but by the interest of very specific European companies.
Fantastic, Diego. Thanks very much indeed. Can I just invite all of our audience to either raise their hands or to put questions into the chat on Zoom or on Facebook while the remainder of our discussants talk. So next, again, thank you, Diego. I turn to Francesco Bonfiglio, who's the Chief Executive Officer at Gaia X, which is basically the creation of a data infrastructure for Europe. Thanks, Francesco.
Thanks, Harry, and thanks, everybody. I mean, I was listening carefully to everybody. I would like to start. A lot of good things have been said. Let me look at the clock. So I'd pick some of the smart things that have been said. One sentence I captured from you, Harry, was regulation often comes too late. I think that's an interesting point we should reflect on. And the second sentence was from Eleonora. She said, citizens need to be protected by something they still don't understand. So when I'm thinking about the Bossy State or all the discussions we are having, I cannot refrain from reflecting on where it all started. And I think that it all started from something we are intrinsically yet scared about because we don't know it. And if we don't know it, we can't control it. And if we can't control it, we don't use it. Because as much as we can talk about, and I heard the MEP, Sabrina, talking about, she said something I totally disagree, but that's a personal opinion, that we would never fill the gap, the technology gap we have with respect to non-European for United States. I don't believe this is the case, but we should consider that we need to understand what is needed and not try to solve the wrong problem. In other words, the level of cloud uptake in Europe nowadays is below 25%. And this should make us think about it. Why? We don't miss the right technology. The technology is there. And the market of cloud in Europe tripled since 2017 to 2020 from 2 to plus than 7 billion euros. And I'm talking about just infrastructure as a service and PaaS and the managed cloud. It's going up to 25 billion if you consider the software as a service. Nonetheless, the market share of European cloud service provider has decreased by 26 down to below 15, and it's going to be less than 10% in 2025. But the overall cloud uptake of European companies is below 25%. Why? It's not because they don't have the technology, it's because they don't trust the technology. And we need to overcome this problem. So I think this is where regulation comes in. But as Henry said, sometimes regulation comes too late. And let me make the example of the Gdpr. Unfortunately, GDPR in 2018 was born. I always make this example when it was too late, because most of the data platforms that we have seen in Francesco's slides at the beginning were, have become rich of data thanks to their regulation. They could afford, they could exploit before the GDPR. Now, when the GDPR came around, people started to say, oh my God, this is something dangerous. So they can steal my data. So this is bad. And all of a sudden, we introduced the first, I think, most impactful regulation. Everybody knows about the GDPR, the privacy regulation. But very few know what's behind it. And the regulation as well, and this is one of my points, I think should be rethought in terms of methodology to produce regulation. Sometimes we confuse laws with policies, with regulations. And most of the time I see that the outcome is a mix of these made in a not very well thought manner. Let me give an example. The GDPR, of course, protects the privacy and imposes even big fines, up to 4% of the revenues if you infringe the GDPR. But very few know that, for example, most of the ransomware that are so scary exploit vulnerabilities. And those vulnerabilities, most of the time, I'm talking about 80% of the time, are due to the wrong patch level, which technically means you don't have all the software stack of your application at the latest level of update. But very few understand that in order to do that in a company that has got possibly 20 years of technology stack, is impossible. So if we make a regulation that is technically, it's a regulation for technology that is technically impossible to implement, and we fine those that accidentally infringe in that, we should ask ourselves, do we have the right people writing the regulation? Do we involve the right people from the industry? Do we have the right industrial policies defined before making that digital policy? I don't think this is the case. So my point is that, and it's a provocation, I know, but I think we should move from tech regulation, Ian said that, into RegTech. I think this is one of the recipes, because there is no way to avoid this divergence from the hyper-regulation, the amount of documents, the 700 plus pages, 500 plus rules. There's no way to shrink it down, although I would hope this would be the future. But if that's not possible, then we need to make sure the regulation can be translated into something doable, understandable, and possibly technically meaningful. And if that is possible, we should do it through technology. So RegTech is the future. And we should also move from generic rules to specific rules.
Francesco, I think we're going to have to. I'm going to have to stop you in a sec.
I will just conclude with one thing that I learned when I was talking to some of the, consultants in the European Commission that were working on the Gdpr. They were very proud of it. And I told them that the effect of the Gdpr for the past 5 years was pretty detrimental for many, in particular European players, unfortunately, because they didn't know how to move ahead. But they told me that when the Gdpr was done, Europe really wanted to give a brand opportunity to European players. But the effect was that just the big ones were capable to do it, and the big ones were not European, and the European ones were not capable to do it. So if regulation is meant to protect or give opportunity also to European players, but more in general to a more fair market, we should make sure that regulation is understandable, is doable, and is possibly automatable, and is made achievable by small medium business, which is 80% of our economy. And nowadays, I don't believe small medium business is, let's say, part of the game when it comes to defining these new rules. I will pause here, of course, aware of time. Thanks, Henry.
Thank you so much, Francesco. Let me turn quickly. We want to leave a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. So let me now turn to Antonio Nicita. Antonio is Professor of Economic Policy at Lumsa University. Hi.
Hi, thank you. So I will talk on that quality, even if I am now in the board, which is the Regulatory Scrutiny Board of the European Commission, but I will say something about this board because it's important in relation to what you said about evidence-based policy and quality of regulation, especially Francesco Bonfiglio. And actually, I was for almost 7 years a regulator in Italy because I was in the board of Telecommunications and Media Authority. And it was an important point of view for me in order to see how regulation has changed also in terms of objective emergence from the traditional network industries, telecommunications and media to the new one. So actually my approach at that time was especially in relation to the traditional incumbents of the industry, telecoms and media, that pushed for activities against the big tech that as a regulator we were not able to do because we have just to apply the law, to say to them, look, these are new entrants in your markets. So you are just defending yourself from new entrants. But then after 7 years, things, of course, changed. And because we see definitely platforms becoming so strong. I agree with what Henry said about bigness and antitrust is not a point. And indeed, I mean, especially in the European approach to antitrust, you know that we have abuse of dominance and we not tackle dominance per se, unless dominance is the result of an anti-competitive merger. And this is still there, even if I have to say that a proposal, one has been introduced in the German antitrust law, and another one is going to be introduced in Italy on this economic dependence, which has nothing to do with traditional definition of market power in distinct relevant markets and not to do with abuse of dominance then, but it's economic dependence. Now, economic dependence is economically a thing that has to do with contractual relationship normally, not to a market position relationship. So in my view, this would somehow pollute the traditional antitrust approach. And I think that when you have antitrust should be very narrow in the application. Then you have also regulation beside antitrust. Now there is a tendency I have seen in the US, but also in Europe, to transform the antitrust interventions from typically ex post antitrust intervention to ex ante, which is more the area of a regulator. But that said, I think that the European approach to regulation, of course, today is very complex, and you are just mentioning the digital interventions, but there is a huge amount of interventions related to environment, environmental law, climate change, and so on, that are the very strong features of the European approach. But I think that what Europe is trying to do is to give an answer that, of course, it's too late. I agree with you, and it's complex. I can assure assure Francesco that there are some other acts that you have not listed. There is an Health Data Act coming. There is an act coming for civil liability on artificial intelligence. There are another act on cyber resilience regarding cybersecurity, and so on and so forth. So there is one issue that I think should be somehow shaped in a better way, which is how to simplify all this production, because different interventions just tackle different problems, but sometimes they overlap, and they are also targeted to so many different platforms and business activities that some order there is needed. What I think is that now we've introduced principles, regulation, but then the implementation will be crucial. And also in terms of simplification, still today we have not clear, and the DSA is one of these acts, what will be the right level of intervention, if just at the European level, or if there will be some subsidiarity for national authorities, and so on and so forth. But what I think that overall there is, I understand that the issue of the Bossy State, but there is an important issue related to platforms. Let me stress that, and then I will conclude, is that platforms are a specific object. Platforms are regulators. They are not just traditional firms operating in distinct relevant markets. They are complex, they are different, they have different business models. The central issue is data on the one side and multi-sided markets on the other. But this kind of business is made by regulation. There is nothing neutral. Okay, everything is designed, is a business model. So the issue that we have to focus on is what is the good boundary between private regulation and public one. And I agree with Francesco Bonfiglio that the issue is how to distinguish between bad regulation and good regulation, which means, in my view, also a regulation that is able to learn through evidence and to adapt over time in a rapid way. This is, I think, the central point. And I think that what we are doing in Europe today is just a first step. We need to learn more, and we need to fine-tuning the rules. But I think that we are in a situation for which some regulation is needed, because the new market failures that we have are indeed new and have to do with the platforms per se, rather than with old ideas of market failures in these markets. But I conclude with one sentence, which is the following. I don't think, and indeed, I'm against some proposals, especially in the United States. I don't think that we need to transform the nature of antitrust. Maybe we need to fine-tuning some intervention. And I was surprised by the US debate, because in the US debate, and this is a strong difference relative to Europe, and I conclude, we have not only abuse of dominant position. Section 2 of the Sherman Act precisely said that the law, through the law, we can tackle monopolization and attempt to monopolize, which means there is theoretically the possibility to have actions against someone with increasing its economic power in the society. So I was always wondering whether in the case of the US, rather than having missing rules, we had an issue of under enforcement of antitrust. And I think this is something that should be somehow discussed a little bit in more detail. And I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Antonio. And to wrap up the discussants, Ernest Wilson, who is the former Dean of Annenberg School of Communication. Ernest, 4 minutes to round this off, please. Thanks very much indeed. You're on mute, Ernest.
I want to thank the panelists for their good interventions. It's been very detailed. And against the kind of debate, or let's say in connection with the kinds of debate that are happening in the United States now with the Biden administration. These are the kinds of questions which are being levied in a pretty serious way, because with the Federal Trade Commission and the Federal Communications Commission and others, there are people who have been appointed to those regulatory agencies who are a bit more forward-leaning and more active, more interested in regulating more generally and not just toward one company or another. So I guess I have just 2 points to make. One is, we have been talking about sectors and governmental agencies. Do we have a commonly agreed upon description of who the stakeholders are and the political actors are in these discussions? And I raise that especially in the United States, because Silicon Valley is getting itself reorganized to protect and extend the kind of privileges that it has now. And we see in the US Senate, there are some political actors who are beginning to change their views about what kind of interventions would be most helpful in the tech economy. So I guess first question would be, who are the political actors? And is it the technology that is changing, or is it the interpretations of their interests by competitors in the European market? And I know that makes it's much more complicated, obviously, in the EU, which has 27 countries. And so therefore identifying transnational political forces, trans-market political forces is certainly much more complicated than in the United States. Why don't I just stop there and see whether or not whether that is a serious issue of identifying who the 4 or 5 major political actors are in Europe, because as was discussed at Francesco's meeting a couple of weeks ago, we have 5 people who are among the richest people in the world who are moving into these markets. And we can describe the market competitiveness, the innovation, et cetera. But if we are also not aware of the enormous power that the billionaires of the world, especially the billionaires of the United States, we also have to take into account their interpretations of what they are trying to do in the markets, because that will be as important as the competitiveness or innovation policies or impacts on consumers. So
Great, Ernest. Ernest, thanks very much indeed. That's great. I'll leave that question for maybe for Francesco Grillo at the end. In the meantime, let me just, we have questions from from Professor Francesco Lapenta, And we also have a question from Rafa Russo. So maybe Francesco Lapenta, can you say your question, please?
So thank you. I'll be brief. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Thank you, Ernest. Actually, you provided me a baseline for my question. I think that something that it's constant in the debate, and it seems to be overlapping with the conversation tonight, is a very unique definition of innovation that is dominated by the conception of innovation as technological innovation. And we counter that with the argument of regulation as something that has an impact on technological innovation. The reality is that we should free the definition of innovation, the realm of technological innovation only, because that's a paradigm that has been dominant because of the linkage between technological innovation and growth. And what is really happening in Europe is basically we're countering the definition of innovation with something that we might want to call public services, or a different definition of innovation that is based on human capital, is based on pushing a specific agenda. I heard no discussion of sustainability in the entire panel. Sustainability is both a technological question, but is also an ethical question. And to me, to say and talk about regulation as a counter to technological innovation is a misnomer that serves well the way of controlling the debate by technology oligarchs and main companies. And we should shift the conversation on different forms of innovation, such as social innovation, of which technology should be a subject and not the driver. So the fact that the EU wants to regulate is not that we are regulating, we are juxtaposing definitions of innovations.
Henry, now you're muted.
Thank you. Yes, I think I'm going to just pass over now to Rafa Russo. Could you make your brief comment as well, please?
Yes, sure, and thank you for this seminar. I guess the only negative thing is if someone connects now can only see a manual, but that was not the beginning of the conversation. I have a question maybe for Professor Nishida, but maybe also for Mr. Bonfiglio, Francesco, Ernest. Like we are, and Jan, obviously, we are talking about platforms and regulating platforms, but meanwhile, Web3 is, according to many, starting to pick up and will take over Web 2, which is dominated by platforms at the center. What's your view about that? Like, what will be the impact of decentralization, blockchain, and Web 3 on the role of platforms? And how should regulators start thinking about that now, rather than when it will be late and urgent? Thank you.
That's a fantastic question. Who wants to jump in there? Francesco Bonfiglio.
If it's okay for you, of course. Antonio, it's okay for you? Do you want me to start?
No,
Yes.
I can come later.
Quickly, good question, good point. I did not want to go into any detail of Gaia-X, but just to give you a very quick highlight. What I said before is that we should move from tech reg into reg tech. I didn't say that by accident, because actually this is the core of what we're doing. So Gaia-X is basically a sort of middleware that is going to connect different nodes of technology, infrastructures, or data. And the architecture that we are implementing is going to provide an objective trust. How to obtain an objective trust nowadays, the only way is to adopt this type of technologies. Basically, decentralized architectures, verifiable claims, trusted anchors, self-identity, and all the technologies that, of course, behind use the blockchain, but forget about the blockchain. The point is move from central platforms and central controllers, because I totally agree with Antonio. The problem is platforms are regulators. This is an extremely important point that he made. So we need to make sure that we change the possibility to regulate of platforms. And the only way to do that is a democratic decentralization. that's exactly the core of the technology we're using at GaiaX. And of course, there's a lot of newbies, new technologies coming around the corner, but there is nothing like that in the market. The reason I'm so excited about GaiaX is that we're trying to build something that is needed, is not there yet, it's not comparable to the incumbent technologies. And therefore, I hope it's going to be an opportunity for everyone, of course, but for sure also for European players that nowadays evidently suffer a position of irrelevance. Antonio.
Yeah, if I may jump, I totally agree with what Francesco just said. And regarding to Raffaele's questions, ciao Raffaele, one point is precisely this one. So decentralization, which means not starting ex post, I mean, in 10 years from now, but now. And I think that the challenge of the implementation of all these acts, I think, for instance, to the Data Governance Act and to the Data Act, there is fundamental need to precisely go in the direction of decentralization with clear rules. And I totally agree about Reg Tech, because we are not, I mean, I'm talking about a past regulator, we are totally not ready to understand or even monitor or design those kind of rules. So we need a new interdisciplinary approach for that. And to the issues raised by the other Francesco, I agree that when we talk about these new digital challenges, if on the there is a sort of bossy digital as well, and I think that it is true that innovation is something that goes behind tech per se, is something that is actually changing the way in which we spread ideas, the way in which we are consuming things, the way in which we are connecting each other. So it's indeed a social innovation as well. But at the same time, I think that we have to approach this without ideological biases of any kind, because then the debate, it depends. No, also in terms of economic powers is important, because we can see that just a social network could change its policy moderation according to the new owner on the one side, but on the others, we also have seen how our political perceptions of big tech may change if there is a war, for instance, if there is some protest elsewhere. So the day before you are the greatest enemy, the day after you are a defender of democracy. So I think we have to be free from ideological constraints and build evidence-based policy precisely on the RegTech scenarios that Francesco was mentioning before.
Ernest, you've got your hand up. Shall I come back to you?
Yes, Henry, if you would. For those of us who are a little bit older, I remember these conversations around Internet 1.0. And there was a lot of huge enthusiasm about the technological innovations and the subsequent economic and social innovations that would come as a result of Internet 1.0. Those of us who were on the outside and being critical about the dystopian possible results were shunted to the side, because the enthusiasm was for the positive scenarios to come happen. And so I would just remind us of the social debate, the intellectual debates that are taking place in Europe now around the metaverse, for example. And I would suggest that we think a little bit broader about who our audiences are. It's very important that the technocrats around the table understand these variables that we're talking about. But I would suggest that's sort of a relatively small yet important circle. Or what it would be the next circle, the second circle, or the third circle, who would be important to inform so that they can make informed judgments, and then to mobilize their own stakeholders so that we have a progressive outcome on things like the metaverse and beyond, rather than a technologically determined and outcome preferred by the billionaires. So again, that political issue and who our audience is, I think, is something that we also might want to consider.
Okay, I'm going to throw the mic open first to Jan and then to Francesco Grillo in order to sum up, if you wouldn't mind. We've reached a good point in this discussion, I think, where we're really thinking about the future and how we can better regulate. Jan, why don't you give us your thoughts on what has this informed us about both the Bossy State and the future of regulation?
So I think it was actually a very interesting discussion. It was especially interesting to hear a panel of mostly Europeans, with the exception of Ernest, who very kindly joins us from the other side of the pond, who are actually sort of maybe not overly enthusiastic for the regulatory state. I mean, a lot of the people we heard today thought that, obviously rules are important, and, even a strident free marketer like myself agrees that, a free market needs some boundaries. A free market only works within the context of certain rules and, and the rule of law and so on and so forth. So I, per se, don't have a problem with regulation. There does sometimes appear in European discussions, from my experience, to be a sort of, it's a reflexive desire to regulate things in a way that sort of that appeals to the Eurocrats, without giving too much thought about the knock-on consequences, sort of unintended consequences, to use a word that has been used. And I think that this discussion, which showed that there is a certain understanding that we shared by me that some regulations are needed, but it's coupled with an understanding that regulations can be harmful, both to technological innovation and perhaps also, partly by extension, to the sort of social innovation that Francesco Lapenta was talking about. Because if they are sort of both technological and social innovation will feed off each other if all goes well, and take us in a positive direction. Technology can make society better, and society can make technology better. And what we want is a sort of positive feedback loop, as opposed to a negative feedback loop that there's always a risk of falling into. So I think I'm quite heartened by the fact that there is a sort of despite the disparity of our backgrounds, there appears to be a relative agreement on that sort of broad philosophy. I'm sure we will disagree. We disagree on some details, and we disagree on how far to go in certain places. But the broad philosophy of how to move into the future, Henry, as you suggested, seems to be, at least in this panel, on the right track. That's where I would stop.
Wonderful. Thanks very much indeed. Francesco, can I give you the closing words? It's been a fascinating discussion. Thank you.
I will be very quick, since I was not so quick at the beginning. Well, number one, it is very useful, as quite a few people in this panel know. We are working on a big project called the Future of Europe, with a number of think tanks and foundations. And so this discussion has been recorded, and will be, it is a very important input to one of the most important concerns that we should have. Number two, however, I think that we must absolutely go more on problem solving. I enjoy a lot, as a quasi-academic, the big philosophical question, but then we urgently need to make some improvements and simplification to, for instance, regulation. Let me give you an example. Quite a few people said that EU regulation may have come too late. There is, for at least one piece of that regulation that is coming too early, which is the one on artificial intelligence. the definition of artificial intelligence that the European Commission is giving is so vague, which seems to say that they do not exactly know how to define what they are talking about. They basically say something like it is a software which is meant to produce recommendation. And by the way, this is, by adopting a definition like that, basically even an Excel is a piece of artificial intelligence, no? Something like that. And this really risks to create over-regulation, no? And harm the European industry. Because again, they say that each piece of artificial intelligence must be overseen by human during its functioning, which means that Europe will never have self-driving cars, for instance, because it does not make sense to have self-driving cars which are monitored constantly by human people. So I think there is something that we must advance as a proposal as quickly as possible. Number three, I think it's probably the most important thing is exactly what, to me, it's what Antonio said. We need evaluation. We need evaluation in a very big way, and we need experimentation. The European Commission, the European Union also talk about sandbox, which is an environment where you experiment things. But I think we need much more than that. Even cities can be places to experiment new modes of innovation. Francesco was talking about social innovation, and we need to have the metrics to understand what is happening, what's not happening, so that we can do the scale up. So this is very hugely important to me, and the European Commission does not seem to be open enough to this idea of experimentation and innovation. As far as the question that Ernest was posing, I don't know the answer, and Harry, by the way, was asking me to answer. What do the ultra billionaires think? I think Ernie is very right saying that they are part of the audience. However, my impression is that nobody has got a real thesis of what is happening. We are navigating in uncharted water, and to try to navigate this uncharted water with 800 pages of regulation does not make sense to me, quite honestly. The very last question that I have is why do we have so few women when we talk about internet regulation? We had, I think we had something like 60 events of the next generation series of Vision, and this is the only one where we didn't get to some gender balance. We only have men at the end of this discussion, and this is something that I'm still wondering, because it is something which started in Silicon Valley. Basically, when we are talking about internet and internet regulation, you tend to have all men, and I think this is a part of the problem. Having said that, thank you very much to everybody.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Francesco. That was a fantastic way of summing it up. I was thinking in terms of what of the question that Ernest posed, that I guess essentially what we have here is we have the bossy state standing up or confronting big tech billionaires who are just as bossy. So it's no wonder that this is a confusing thing. I have been, I hope, a rather light touch regulator when it comes to this panel, because we're 20 minutes over time. So I think with that, we'll call an end to it. And I just want to thank Francesco and Vision very much indeed for this. Thank you. Cheers, guys.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Henry. Thank you, Jan. Thank everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.